Hello, my name is Dr. Sharon Skembry and I'm here today to talk to you about international business. This recording will be the first of a series of recordings provided in the coming weeks and months that take us through Charles Hill's textbook on international business. Now, Dr. Hill, his book has an emphasis on competing in a global marketplace, and there's 20 chapters. We're going to step through each of those 20 chapters, not necessarily in order, but we will get through all of it. Throughout this series of recordings, we're going to focus in on the fast-changing nature of international business, which is very relevant in this context of the global pandemic that we currently find ourselves in. And we're also going to look at the rise of emerging economies. We're going to talk about how culture matters, as does sustainability, business ethics, and corporate social responsibility. We're going to look at the differing political and economic policies that are relevant to international business. And we're going to touch on the global monetary systems that we have to deal with in the context of international business. To end, we'll finish with the strategy and structure of international business, including the managerial functions of an astute international operation. Okay, so today we're going to start with chapter 1, and I'm going to share my screen and we're going to get going. All right, so this chapter is titled simply Globalization, and that's where we learn about what is meant by this term of globalization. We look at the drivers of globalization. We describe the changing nature of the global economy. We look at the arguments for and against globalization and the process of managing an international business. So when we look at the question of what is globalization, we're talking about two things: the globalization of markets and the globalization of production. The globalization of markets is about bringing together historically distinct geographies, historically distinct separate national markets into the one marketplace, one global village. And this globalization of markets has been facilitated because of decreasing trade and investment barriers across geographic borders. Now, the globalization of markets does entail products that serve universal needs, such as commodities, for example, oil, right? But there's also variation in a global marketplace. There is significant differences between national markets that international operators need to be very cognizant of. Now, these similarities and differences generate benefits for organizations small and large. A small organization in this globalized market may well be able to reach internationally, whereas before that might not have been possible. And similarly, for a large organization, it might be actually viable for them to serve a market niche that was not previously. Now, another thing that happens with globalization of markets is that the competitors that operators have to deal with may not vary so much from nation to nation. All right, let's talk about the globalization of production. So what we're talking about here is taking advantages of differences in the cost and quality of factors of production. Now, the factors of production include labor, energy, land, and capital. So when the cost of labor is actually much less in a different country, then it may well make economic sense to go and manufacture in that particular country. But maybe there's good reasons to not decide to do that as well. Anyway, so early outsourcing. Outsourcing is about when we contract an organization in a foreign market to do our manufacturing, for example, right? So early outsourcing was confined to manufacturing, but with technology, outsourcing has extended into the services sector. Now, because we have products that might comprise of component parts that come from different parts of the world, then this is what Robert Wright talks about as global products. So products such as an iPhone, for example, bits and pieces come from different parts of the world, and therefore we might talk about this as a global product. Now, one of the issues with production of global products is that there's impediments, there's barriers to stop us from engaging in activities in the optimal location. These barriers include formal and informal barriers to trade, barriers to foreign and direct investment, transportation costs, as well as political and economic risk, and then the challenge of coordinating supply chains internationally. So because of the rise of globalization, there's been institutions that have emerged to facilitate the process. And these institutions have emerged to help manage, to regulate, and even police this emergent global marketplace. Some of these institutions include the GATT, which is short for General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the WTO, which is short for World Trade Organization, the IMF, which is short for International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, as well as the United Nations and G20. We're going to talk about each of these in turn, so let's go. Now, the GATT was arrived at first in 1947, and it came about because an international forum of operators wanted to encourage free trade between certain nations by regulating reduced tariffs on trade and finding a common mechanism to resolve trade disputes. Anyway, what ended up happening was that 110 countries made an agreement. It's now referred to as GATT. Recently, GATT has included a consideration of environmental policy, which is excellent in terms of sustainability. Okay. So the World Trade Organization came about 50 years after GATT was implemented. So GATT provided the rules, and the WTO is the institution that polices those rules to make sure that nation states follow the rules, right? So this WTO, World Trade Organization, facilitates multinational agreements amongst 164 nations. And this collectively, this group accounts for 98% of the world trade as of 2019. The IMF was established in 1945, headquartered in Washington, DC, and the IMF was created to maintain order in the international monetary system. IMF is a collective of 190 countries working to foster this cooperation on global monetary systems. Now, the IMF is actually seen as a lender of last resort because nation states that go to IMF for a loan, they are required to adopt specific policies laid down by IMF that are designed to return that nation state economy to stable growth. The World Bank is considered less controversial than the IMF. It was established in 1944 to promote economic development. And the World Bank is more focused on low interest loans to poorer nations and will support the significant infrastructure investments for those developing nations. The United Nations established 1945 to promote peace through international cooperation and collective security. We're talking about 193 member countries and 4 basic purposes: maintain international peace and security, develop friendly relations among nations, cooperate in solving international problems, especially with regards to human rights, and be a centre for harmonising the actions of nations. The G20 is about a group of 19 of the largest economies in the world, plus the EU and the European Central Bank. So that's where we get the G20 from, the group of 20. And this group represents 90% of global GDP and 80% of international global trade. Okay, let's talk about the drivers of globalization. First of all, we have to flag these declining trade and investment barriers. So prior to 1920, there wasn't much international business going on. There was some, but not a lot. And then in the 1930s, we were looking at the Depression years. So the 1920s and to 30s, we can recognize that there were many barriers to international trade as well as foreign direct investment. And the GATT lowered these barriers. The Uruguay round extended GATT and established the World Trade Organization in 1995, as we mentioned. These declining trade and investment barriers are evident in the numbers over the years. Between 1960 and 2018, the value of the world economy increased nearly 9.4 times, while the value of international goods increased 22.4 times. So trade in goods and services and the value of foreign direct investment have all been growing faster than world output. More firms are putting production processes in different locations around the globe. And what this means is that the economy of nation states is becoming more independent. So the outcome of all of that is that the world has become significantly wealthier in the past 20 years. But in the context of the coronavirus, this increased international interdependency has meant that global supply chains have brought the global economy to a grinding halt. So this graph shows us between 1960 and 2018 or 2019 that the world GDP has been steadily increasing, but rising at an even more rapid pace has been the merchandise trade index, and between 1960 and 2018. So the value of the world output has been increasing much faster than the global GDP. All right, let's bring all of this down into the context of the global pandemic. The IMF estimates that the global economy shrank by 4.4% in 2020. With the exception of China, basically the global economy shrank. China, unlike the rest of the world, registered a growth of 2.3%. Okay, good news for China, bad news for the rest of the world. But the IMF is also predicting a global growth of 5.2% in 2021. So it's a matter of watch this space. We'll see how we go. This graph is showing us by the light red and the dark red areas here as the countries that are in recession. So basically we're saying that most of the world is currently in recession. All right. Now, apart from decreasing tariffs on trade and investment, other drivers of globalization include technological innovations across sectors such as telecommunications, cyberspace, the internet, and transportation. Let's talk about each of those three. So in the world of communications, the microprocessor has been the single most important innovation since World War II, and the cost of this technology has been decreasing since that time. In cyberspace, more than half of the world's population uses the internet, but in stating that fact, we have to recognize that there is indeed a digital divide. What's really interesting is that nation states with that are lacking internet infrastructure have been able to engage in global e-commerce regardless of that lacking internet infrastructure. I'm talking about, for example, Indonesia. And we'll talk about that more as we go along. But global e-commerce sales are currently over $2.5 trillion. In the realm of transportation, in the last 70 years, we've seen the arrival of commercial jets. On the oceans, we've seen the super freighters arrive, and containerization. These things have shrunk the world. And effectively, what it means is that global trade has been facilitated. So globalization of markets has meant that cultural distance has reduced, and there has been some convergence of consumer tastes and preferences. The implications for the globalization of production has meant that international operators can locate their production in different locations that are more economical. Okay. All right. Let's talk about the changing demographics of the global economy. Changing world output and the world trade picture has definitely changed for the US, and not for the better, actually. In the 1960s, the US accounted for more than 38% of world output, whereas in 2018, the US accounted for just 24% of world output. And this fact reflects the rise of China. And predictions indicate that the Chinese economy will actually overtake the US by 2028. Now, apart from China, other emerging economies include Brazil, Russia, and India. In fact, such developing nations may account for more than 60% of the world economic activity by 2025. Now, there's also a changing story in terms of foreign direct investment. So as trade barriers fall, non-American firms are increasingly investing outside of their home countries, outside of their national borders. So just like American organizations have been looking for more economical, more optimal locations to outsource their manufacturing to, so too have non-US firms been outsourcing to more economical and optimal locations. And so we end up with this outward stock of foreign investment. Media headlines currently have announced that China is, as of now, has overtaken the US as the world's leading destination for foreign direct investment. And we see this trend represented graphically here. The red bars are indicative of the developed countries and the trend for them from 1990 to 2020, so over 30 years, there has been a fluctuation in foreign direct investment inflows. This is in millions of dollars. But look at the green bars. This is the developing countries, right? So not only have they been holding their own, they have been increasing their foreign direct investment inflows. And part of that, how they've achieved that, is through reduced regulations with regards to foreign direct investment. Notably, each nation will have their own rules and regulations with regards to foreign direct investment. So what we end up with is this changing story for multinational organizations, especially with regards to non-American multinational organizations. So in 2003, 38.8% of the world's 2,000 largest multinational organizations were American. By 2019, that percentage had dropped to 28.8%. So a drop of 201 firms out of the top 2,000 global firms. Here we see that represented graphically with the red portion of this pie chart indicating 29% of American firms were the largest multinational corporations in 2019, whereas the rest, 70% of this pie chart, is the rest of the world. So in other words, the rest of the world is catching up to the US. So part of this story is the rise of mini multinationals. We're talking about small and medium-sized businesses that are extending their reach internationally, and part of how they're achieving that is through the internet. The internet is a deregulated space that they are taking well advantage of. So we have this changing world order. Not only is the economic powerhouse of the US reducing, but former communist countries, for example, present export and investment opportunities. While the risks of doing business may be high in these countries, there are good reasons to not dismiss these countries. China is moving to secure their superpower weight in the global marketplace, and places like Brazil are becoming more and more attractive to international investment. So let's sum this up. The global economy of the 21st century is a story of reduced barriers to the free flow of goods and services. It's a story where there's widespread adoption of liberal economic policies by countries that had previously opposed such policies. But we need to recognise that globalisation is not inevitable. Some countries may well choose to pull back, and the risks are high, so we need to know what our risk tolerance is. There are protests against globalisation, and these began in Seattle in 1999, and typically any major meeting of global institutions will now involve protesters. Protesters against globalisation argue that there are detrimental effects on living conditions, wages, as well as the environment. And while some theory and evidence may suggest that these fears are exaggerated or unwarranted, scientific research has shown that the COVID-19 global pandemic that we currently face is a result of the reduced biodiversity. In other words, the neglect of the environment. In terms of jobs and income, critics of globalization argue that reduced trade barriers and translating to organizations shifting their manufacturing to places where the wages are lower destroys manufacturing jobs in the developed nations. And if we recognize that outsourcing has now extended into the services sector, then this increases unemployment again and lowers the living standards in the developed nations. In terms of labour policies and the environment, critics of globalisation argue that environmental regulations increase manufacturing costs, and the lack of regulation can actually lead to abuse. So critics of globalisation are recognising that organisations will deliberately move production to nations that do not have regulations. So, of course, that's detrimental to the environment. In contrast, supporters argue that tougher environmental regulations and tougher labour standards go hand in hand with economic progress. So they're suggesting that free trade leads to less labour exploitation and less pollution. So what this graph is showing us here is that as income increases per head, per person, per capita in the population, the pollution level for most pollutants, which is the green curve that you see there, it does increase, but then it falls as income passes above and beyond the $8,000 per capita, apart from carbon dioxide emissions, right? So the other pollutants that they're talking about there are, for example, sulfur or sulfur dioxide or lead. Okay, so these eventually come down, but not so for carbon dioxide, and hence the argument for environmental pollution is questioned. All right, the globalization debate with regards to national sovereignty, the argument by the critics is that the shift of power away from national governments and toward these supranational organizations, is problematic. The critics don't want these superpowers to be holding the final decision. They want to give the power back to the national governments, the independent nation states. In contrast, supporters of globalization argue that these supranational organizations such as WTO and the United Nations is limited to what the nation states actually agree to. And so these supranational organizations serve the collective interests of the nation states. With regards to poverty and globalization, critics argue that the gap between the rich and the poor nations has gotten wider. There's a rise of totalitarian governments. Poor economic policies are more prevalent, as is corruption and the lack of property rights. There is expanding populations in developing countries and increased debt burdens. Supporters argue that the best way to change the situation is to facilitate trade, international trade and investment, and promote free market policies with lower barriers. This graph is showing us that poverty has actually decreased from the early 80s to the current day. And we can see that if we consider the people that are living on less than $2 a day on the blue line, and people that are living, the percentage of population living on less than $6 a day at the red line. All right, now, as an astute manager in the global marketplace, we need to recognise that managing an international business is not as easy as managing a domestic business. There's much variation in the international marketplace, and this range of problems may well be more intense and complex. We have to find ways to work within the limits imposed by the governments of foreign nations that we want to do business in. And of course, our transactions need to take into account the conversion rates, the exchange rates across different nation states, across different currencies. All right, so there you go. There's chapter 1. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.